My name is Thomas. I am 72 years old, and I have been sitting on the edge of this cold metal bed for exactly 5 decades. If you close your eyes right now, you might be able to hear the sound that has been the soundtrack of my existence. The metallic echo of the guard's boots hitting the concrete, and the electric buzz of the fluorescent light that never fully turns off. 50 years is enough time to forget the taste of a fruit picked straight from the tree, or the sensation of the real wind on your face. But it is not enough to erase the image of that damn key turning in the ignition. I am prisoner number 482, a man who grew old between gray walls, while the world outside turned and transformed without me. The smell of cheap disinfectant and oxidized iron has seeped into my skin in a way that no bath will ever be able to remove. Many in here carry blood on their hands and stories of violence that would make your spine chill. But my tragedy is silent, and for that very reason, much more devastating. I never pointed a gun at anyone. I never wished for the death of a fellow human being, and I didn't even get out of that car on that winter night. Yet I am paying the same price as the murderer. Justice does not care if you just wanted to be a good friend, or if your mistake lasted only 5 minutes. The weight of the steel is the same for everyone who crosses the line of complicity. I have seen young men enter here and leave in coffins. I have seen empires fall and technologies emerge that I don't even understand, all while I remained motionless in this cell. Listen carefully to what I have to say, because every word of mine was bought with a year of the life I threw away. At 22, my world was measured by the size of wrenches and the heat of engines that had already seen better days. I was a mechanic's apprentice in a dusty industrial neighborhood where the sun seemed filtered through the smoke of the factories. My hands were always stained with black grease, a mark of pride for a young man who believed that hard work was the only honest way to build a future. I spent my days hunched over rusted chassis, breathing in the smell of motor oil and diesel, dreaming of the day I would have my own shop. It was a simple and predictable life, full of the clinking of tools and the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. I felt invincible in my coveralls, anchored by the weight of the metal and the certainty that tomorrow was guaranteed by the constant effort of someone who wasn't afraid to get dirty. In my neighborhood, loyalty wasn't just a word. It was the air we breathed and the silent contract we signed every time we shared a cheap beer on the sidewalk. We were boys who grew up on the same cracked concrete, and for us, staying together was the greatest virtue a man could have. I was known as the reliable guy, the friend who would never turn his back on a brother, even when my intuition told me that some were following dangerous paths. My fatal mistake was a misplaced sense of honor, an inability to say no because I feared being seen as weak or unfaithful to the group. We spent our nights leaning against the hoods of old cars, talking about the future, while the shadows of the lampposts stretched across our young faces. I didn't realize that my blind loyalty was, in fact, the cell I was building for myself. That Friday started like any other, with the familiar ache in my shoulders after a long shift and the expectation of a quiet weekend. There was a comfort in the repetition of my life, a sense of security in the dirt under my fingernails and the small piece of land I hoped to buy one day. I had a clear path laid out before me, involving marriage, children, and a dignified retirement after decades of honest work. The world felt solid under my boots, and the idea of a jail cell was as foreign to me as the moon itself. I was just a worker, a dreamer, a son who still lived with his mother and promised her a better house with every paycheck. I didn't know that my entire existence was about to be reduced to a single choice made inside the cabin of a car. The hammer was already falling silently. The Friday night was freezing, the kind that makes the metal of the tools bite the skin, and your breath turn into smoke in the still air. I was exhausted, the smell of kerosene still clinging to my hands, when that childhood friend leaned against my car with a strange urgency in his eyes. He spoke softly, asking for just a quick ride to a house in the suburbs to settle an old debt that couldn't wait. My intuition gave a snap, a dull warning in the back of my chest. But the voice of that blind loyalty spoke much louder than my common sense. "You don't even need to get out, Thomas. Just stay in the car with the engine running. It'll take 2 minutes," he promised with a hand on my shoulder. I sat on the cracked vinyl seat, gripped the cold plastic steering wheel, and turned the key in the ignition. I sat there, looking at the windshield fogged by my own breath, watching the white smoke from the exhaust rise under the pale light of a solitary street lamp. The analog clock on the dashboard ticked forward in a piercing silence while I tapped my nervous fingers on the rim of the wheel, impatient to go home and finally take the weight off my boots. It was exactly 3 minutes of a deceptive quiet, interrupted only by the ticking of the engine metal cooling down and the distant sound of a barking dog. Then, the dry sound of a single gunshot ripped through the calm of the night, coming from inside that dark house like an unexpected thunderclap announcing a storm of blood. That snap wasn't just a bullet leaving a metal barrel. It was the exact sound of my future being shattered into 1,000 unreal and definitive pieces. The passenger door was flung open with brutal violence, and he threw himself inside the vehicle, exhaling a metallic smell of burnt gunpowder and absolute panic. There were dark, damp stains on his jacket, something that shimmered ominously under the faint light of the dashboard, and his screams for me to accelerate seemed to come from an abyss. In that eternal second, I had the chance to turn off the engine and run into the darkness, to refuse to be the accomplice to that tragedy. But paralyzing fear took total control of my limbs. I floored the accelerator, feeling the tires scream on the cold midnight asphalt, and every yard the car moved was an immense distance I placed between myself and a decent life. I realized with terrifying clarity that the young mechanic had died on that dark sidewalk. The sirens didn't take long to appear behind us, a hypnotic dance of red and blue lights reflecting in the rearview mirror that seemed to pulse like a dying heart. I remember the weight of the handcuffs, cold and biting into my wrists, as the police forced me against the hood of my own car, the same hood I had polished so carefully just a few days before. In the interrogation room, the air was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes, and a detective with tired eyes told me that just driving was enough to bury me alive. He pronounced the words felony murder as if he were reading a grocery list, indifferent to the fact that my soul was evaporating right there under those fluorescent lights. I tried to explain that I was just a mechanic, a worker, but the law only saw a getaway driver waiting for a crime. The most brutal part wasn't the police. It was seeing my mother's face through the small glass of the visiting area for the first time. She looked smaller, aged 10 years in a single night, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the barrier that now separated us forever. I saw the shame and confusion in her eyes, the silent question of how her boy, who loved engines and old records, could be linked to such a dark and violent act. That was my first real loss, the destruction of the man she thought she had raised, and the sudden realization that I would never sit at her kitchen table again. The isolation began there, in that cold room, where I realized my name was being erased from the world of the living and written into the records of the condemned forever. The trial was a blur of technical terms and looks of contempt from people who had never stepped foot in my neighborhood or smelled my grease. The judge hammered the sentence with an indifference that chilled my spine. Life imprisonment, without any chance of parole. An entire lifetime for 5 minutes of stupid loyalty. When the guards led me through the echoing corridors to my first real cell, the sound of the steel door sliding on its tracks and slamming with a dry thud was the final period of my existence. In that initial darkness, smelling the damp concrete and fear, I understood that freedom was a dream I had just murdered without firing a single shot. I was no longer Thomas. I was just a body occupying a numbered space in this cold box. By year 5, the silence from the outside began to scream louder than the shouts in the cell block during the night. In the beginning, letters arrived with the frequency of the tides, full of promises that I wouldn't be forgotten, and that some legal appeal would soon get me out of there. But time in prison is a slow acid that corrodes even the solidest friendships from the old blue-collar neighborhood where I grew up. The envelopes, once scented with the smell of normal life and hope, dwindled until the mailbox of my soul was completely empty and dusty. I realized the world outside was moving on. The cars I used to fix were turning into scrap, and the people I loved were learning to live without the driver who never returned. The realization of my permanence fell with the weight of an anvil on my chest. When I completed 15 years of incarceration, the prison chaplain called me into his office, a place where the walls seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 silent laments. He didn't need to say much. The look of pity in his eyes delivered the news to me even before his mouth opened to speak. My mother had passed away from a sudden heart attack, taking with her the last piece of light that still connected me to my childhood and my dignity. There was no goodbye, no final touch of her calloused hand on mine, only the coldness of an official report and the absolute prohibition of attending the funeral. I mourned in total silence, hugging my own knees in that 6-square-meter concrete box, feeling that the last anchor holding me to humanity had been abruptly cut. In year 30, physical aging began to charge a high and cruel price that I wasn't prepared to pay in daily installments of pain. My joints, accustomed to the constant cold of the cement floor and the hardness of a 3-centimeter thick mattress, began to protest with every movement. I found myself watching the new inmates, loud and impulsive young men, and I realized they looked at me with a mix of respect and horror, as if I were part of the very structure of the building. I became the old man of the yard, a piece of institutionalized furniture that no longer remembered how it felt to walk more than 50 meters in a straight line without hitting a fence. The fatigue was no longer just muscular. It was a weariness of the soul that accumulated in every new wrinkle that appeared. The repetitive institutional routine became my only clock, a grinding gear that turned decades into a gray blur of plastic trays and nightly counts. As the decades passed, I realized with a calm dread that I had forgotten basic sensory details that were once my reason for living and breathing every day. I could no longer clearly evoke the smell of the sea on a Sunday morning, or the soft sound of the wind blowing through the leaves of the trees. The deafening noise of the cell block, with its screams, banging, and the incessant hum of industrial ventilation, became my only concept of silence and peace. My mind, once full of engine designs and electrical diagrams, was being colonized by the sterile void of an existence where nothing changes except the depth of the shadows. Now, 50 years into my confinement, I look into the scratched metal mirror above the stainless steel sink and see a 72-year-old stranger staring back at me. The young mechanic with strong arms and big dreams died so long ago that sometimes I doubt he ever really existed outside of my tired imagination. I feel the weight of every wasted day as if I were carrying an entire engine on my back, a load I can never set down anywhere until the end. The feeling of time thrown in the trash is a wound that never heals, fed by the awareness that the world outside has evolved into something I wouldn't even recognize anymore. I am a living fossil, a relic of a 5-minute mistake that turned into an eternity of regret and absolute loneliness here. I spent a good part of these 5 decades trying to convince myself that I was just a passenger of bad luck, a victim of circumstances and the malice of others. In the darkness of the cell, I fed a silent rage against the system and against that friend who, with a single bullet, destroyed my destiny and his own. I looked at my hands, clean of blood, and told myself that I didn't belong in this place of beasts and shadows, repeating that the driver shouldn't carry the burden of the shooter. But truth is a monster that doesn't accept lies for long, and it began to devour me from the inside with a terrifying clarity. I understood that my greatest crime was not a gunshot, but my own cowardice disguised as blind loyalty. I had every chance to turn off the engine, to say no, and to get out of that car before hell opened up. But I preferred the comfort of approval from those who were worth nothing. Today, as I hear the echo of the guard's footsteps fading down the cold corridor, the realization has finally settled like a heavy stone in the bottom of my stomach. I realize that the loyalty I prized so much was, in fact, the first bar that I myself welded around my soul long before the judge hammered the gavel. I was a man who didn't know how to set boundaries, who feared the judgment of street corner boys more than I feared my own moral ruin. This need to belong, to be the cool guy who never denies a favor, is what brought me to this thin mattress and this eternal smell of mold and oxidized metal. I wasn't just an accomplice to a murder. I was the architect of my own systematic destruction. Guilt is no longer an external noise, but an intimate and painful conversation I have with the silence of this cell every morning, without any hope of absolution or going home. I was in the prison infirmary a few months ago, under that white and sterile light that makes everything look like a morgue before its time. I saw a man, as old and broken as I am, take his last breath on a creaking cot, with no one to hold his hand except an impatient nurse who just wanted to fill out the paperwork. At that moment, the image of my old friend, the man who fired the gun on that winter night, came to my mind with brutal force. He died of cancer in here 10 years ago, consumed by his own darkness, and I, the harmless driver, am still here breathing the same stale air. It was there, watching the cold body of that stranger being taken away, that the truth finally completed its painful journey. I realized that time makes no distinction between the one who pulled the trigger and the one who just kept the path clear for the tragedy to happen. That night, back in my cell, I lay staring at the peeling ceiling and the shadows the bars cast on the gray wall. In the quiet of the curfew, I understood that the weapon that destroyed my life and buried me alive was not the silver revolver my friend carried. The true instrument of my crime was the ignition key that I, and only I, decided to turn in that freezing vinyl seat. I chose to stay, I chose to accelerate, and I chose to ignore the scream of my conscience in the name of a friendship that was already dead on arrival. The weight of these 50 years is not the result of an injustice of fate, but the exact outcome of that small turn of metal in the car's ignition. Accepting that I was the author of my own captivity hurts much more than any sentence a judge could read out loud. The lesson that the loneliness of this concrete has taught me is that there are no small decisions or unimportant favors when your dignity is at stake. Often we convince ourselves that we are just helping an acquaintance or avoiding a nuisance conflict. But every small moral concession is a brick you lay in the wall that might one day surround you completely. Loyalty offered to the wrong people is not a man's virtue. It is a silent poison that blinds your judgment and hands you over, bound hand and foot, to the cruel fate of someone who no longer has anything to lose in life. If I could talk to a young mechanic today, I would tell him that the courage to say no is the most valuable tool he could ever carry. Learn to listen to your inner voice before the metallic sound of the lock becomes permanent. Your freedom is not just the physical absence of bars, but the quality of the choices you make when social pressure tightens its grip on your neck. I discovered, in the most bitter way, that the first prison we inhabit is built inside ourselves, fed by the fear of appearing cowardly, or the desperate need to be accepted by groups that add nothing to our lives. When you agree to participate in something that violates your fundamental principles, even if it's just watching from a distance with the engine running, you are already handing over the keys to your future, to the malice of others. Life does not usually forgive omission, and human justice rarely cares about the supposed purity of your intentions if your actions contributed to a real tragedy. Preserve your moral autonomy above all else, because once lost, the gray walls rise too fast. I see you, there on the other side of the screen, living a life full of noise, haste, and small choices that seem to have no weight at the end of the day. Maybe you're about to do a favor for someone, just so you don't seem rude. Or maybe you're ignoring that strange tightness in your chest, just to feel like part of a group that, deep down, you know isn't worth it. Do not make the mistake of believing that you are safe just because you aren't holding the gun. Life has a cruel way of collecting the full price from those who choose to just observe the mistakes of others in silence. Every small concession you make today is a steel wire that could end up tying you to a reality you never wanted. Stop for a second and look at the hands you still have free. Who is really turning the key to your life right now? The sun has already set a long time ago behind those bars high up there, and I can already hear the metallic rattle of the last nightly count cart approaching in the cold corridor. I am going to spend another night here, submerged in the darkness of this cell, while you still have the privilege of simply opening the door of your house and breathing the fresh air of freedom under the stars. Do not waste your existence being the silent passenger on the journey of people who have no direction. The key to your destiny must always be in your hands. Before the silence closes over me, tell me, what was that one small, bad decision you made in the past just to please someone, and which by pure luck didn't ruin the rest of your life? Write it down below. Your story might be the warning someone else needs. The iron is about to slam.